So continuing, product and production space, our next speaker is Pablo Azar. He's the chief economist of Algorand. He's a dual PhD. So he got a PhD in computer science at MIT and then decided, why not get a second one? And so also has a PhD in economics from MIT. He's, I believe I've known him for a very long time. We met in freshman year of college here at Harvard. He was an applied math major, same graduating class. I believe he's the only member of our undergraduate class to have 2 PhDs. We just had our 10-year reunion, so that basically, anybody else would have had to have like a very, very fast, speedy account to even make that. And my understanding is you literally just received the second PhD like a couple days ago. Is this accurate, the final processing?
I got an email from my third reader that they approved it.
Excellent. So this is this is completely accurate and super cool. He's, as you might expect, given his background, exceedingly well published across multiple fields. Both top computer science conferences, work in stats and algorithms around law, and also, of course, top economics research, including the paper we're going to see today, Endogenous Production Networks, which I understand is, as of also very recently, forthcoming in Econometrica, which is one of the top journals in the economics profession. So I'm sure you appreciate any referees who happen to be sitting in the room. I'll say thank you on your behalf. He can apparently bench 1.5 times me. I asked for a side note, and that was, I was given an actual number, but I've converted it into units of Scott. And I should say, I mentioned I've known him for a very long time, like almost 15 years at this point. He has always been one of the coolest people I've known. This was true even in freshman year. It was like totally obvious that he was a total beast and going to do extraordinary things. And he's also one of the best at sort of seeing ideas across areas and linking them together. So it's particularly wonderful to have him at the Big Data Conference where this is what we're all trying to do. Let's welcome Pablo to tell us about endogenous production networks.
Thank you, Scott. Can you guys hear me in the back? Good. I hope I live up to that introduction. This paper is about production networks, and what's a production network? It's a fancy word for a supply chain. And one of the facts that we are trying to capture in this paper is that the supply chain for many industries have become more complex, and they have also introduced new input combinations over time. So one of my favorite examples is that car manufacturing has moved from its original reliance on wood and steel that people used to make the very first cars. And now when you have a contemporary car, people use aluminum alloys, carbon fibers, electronics, sensors, and most notably recently, robotics to replace the labor in the manufacturing process. The same thing is true of almost any product that you can find is now made very, very differently and with a much more complex production chain than it used to be even decades ago. Now, this we can see in the data. This picture is from the US input-output table that measures which industries buy from which other industries and how much. And what we see is that the number of supplier industries for the average industry has increased from about 43.6 in 1963 to 53.4 in 1986. Just for context, there's about 63 industries in this matrix. And all this shows is that that matrix, that graph, has been getting denser over time. And if you compare it to other countries like Argentina, where I'm from, you'll see that developed countries like the United States have much, much denser supply chains than developing countries like Argentina. It's much easier for companies to buy from any industry in a developed country than it is for companies in a developing country to obtain new materials, new inputs, new resources. And the questions I'm going to deal in this paper are what explains these changes in the supply chain? Does the fact that all these industries are changing their suppliers? Does it make them more productive? And can these new input combinations, can these changes in suppliers drive productivity growth? And since there are many non-economists in the audience, let me just take a quick pause to ask, why do we care? What is productivity? We care because at the end of the day, as economists, we care about asking this question. Why are some countries relatively rich, and why are some countries relatively poor? And this is a work that comes from a very, very long line of literature, going at least back to Simon Kuznets, but honestly, even back to Adam Smith. And one of the first conjectures you could make is countries that have more population are richer. They have more labor, they can make more things. That's not true. We see that even in GDP per capita, China and India are not surpassing the United States or Luxembourg. Another thing could be that countries that have more capital, more resources, that they're richer, more natural resources they can extract from the ground. And again, if you think about large countries in area and natural resources, it's not just a ranking by natural resources. And what work since Simon Kuznets, Robert Barro, Kaldor, a long, long line of generations of economists, what they found is that it's productivity that corresponds to GDP per capita. It's not how many inputs you have, it's not how many people you have, it's how much output you can make with the inputs you have. So the US is very productive, so is Luxembourg, so is Europe, and countries that are developing, they are on the way there. So this is what this paper is trying to answer is, does the fact that these supply chains are very dense in developing countries and very dense in developed countries and very sparse in developing countries, can that explain economic growth? So going down more precisely, what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to develop a tractable model of endogenous production networks. So I've already told you what a production network is. It's a fancy word for supply chain. Endogenous means that this supply chain is going to be determined by economic agents that are maximizing their own profits, if they're firms, or their own utility, if they are consumers. And there's going to be an economic equilibrium, and there's going to be no central planner here. And by the way, just as an aside, even though time is short, if you go to the data, the exception that I told you about countries that are poor but have relatively dense supply chains is former communist countries, including China and including many Eastern European countries and Russia, because this is something that former communist governments, they really wanted this central planning, and they basically said, you have to buy from these factories and you have to buy from these factories, so that their networks were very dense, but because it was all government mandated, they weren't actually making things people wanted. In this model, there's no central planner. It's all market driven. And this is what we show, that an equilibrium exists and is generically unique. That means the market will find the optimal supply chain. And it's going to feature a new type of monotonicity, that if you have a better technology, you're going to reduce the prices of all the goods. And furthermore, and there's some very, very natural assumptions, what we're going to have is that if your technology improves, let's say I improve computers by making them cheaper, smaller, faster, more efficient, that is going to not only make computers more adopted as an input in the supply chains, but it's also going to make everything that adopts computers have a spillover effect, and those products are going to be adopted. So now I can put a computer inside a machine that builds cars, and maybe those cars will become cheaper, and they will also become more adopted by more people and more industries. So two more things, and I get one saying to say this is the big data conference, so here's my data, and here's the preview of my data. One of the main contributions of this model, which I will have only one slide about, is that it creates a completely new model of endogenous economic growth. And again, endogenous means market-driven. There are firms, researching new technologies and trying to find what's best for them. And this process is very rational. It's not ad hoc or saying that, growth just happens. There's a market force driving growth. And in our model, the market force driving growth is this idea that you choose your suppliers. And you can think of different discrete combinations. So I can make, I'm going to give like the silliest example, but I can make a cake with flour, butter, eggs, and so on, or I can make it with cake mix and water. And those are going to be two very different recipes for making a cake. And one of them is going to be more productive than the other. And the more recipes I have for making it, the more draws from a productivity distribution I'm going to get. So the more tries I'm going to get at making something that is cheap, that's affordable, and that's also high quality. But I said it for cakes, which is a silly example, but you can also say it for cars. You can also say it for electronics. You can also say it for machinery. That if there are multiple ways of combining inputs to make a new product, every single time that a new possible input gets added, I double the number of possible combinations I can try. And because I double the number of possible combinations I can try, I double the ways that I can make a new discovery. And finally, we do take this to the data. So we have some regression results showing that firms or industries that drastically change their set of suppliers, they do become more productive. And also, because the model is very tractable, it's very easy to do Bayesian simulations to answer questions like, how would the supply chain of the United States change if I suddenly make the electronic sector 1% more productive? If for every kilogram of silicone and like labor and so on, if now I had 1% more output of electronics as before, now it becomes cheaper, it becomes more adopted by other industries, the whole network changes, and that has spillover effects. And that's a simulation we can do with this model. This falls into some like very recent but growing literature. Up to about 2017, most of the papers that try to study questions like this had very ad hoc rules for how these networks form. And if you know about social network theory, this was essentially preferential attachment. So there's this very seminal paper by Carvalho and Voigtlander. And essentially what they say is, with some probability that falls from the sky, I am going to choose one of my supplier's supplier as my own supplier. So there's some notion of preferential attachment, but it's very ad hoc, and there's no profit maximization motive in there. The most related paper to ours is this paper by Oberfield, who does develop a profit maximization model for supply formation. But instead of having a market setting prices by the market clearing, he has a bargaining process. So you're going to go to all your possible suppliers, and you're going to bargain to see whether you form that relation or not. And that makes it a little bit less tractable. It's still a very interesting paper. So if you're interested in this topic, definitely go read it. And here's my roadmap. Obviously, I'm not going to get to all of these things today. And I've like selectively chosen things that I think would be interesting to this audience. So let me get on the way with that. Most of this talk is going to be about this model, and at the end, I'm going to get to how we fit it to the data. So I try to select the things of the model that are relevant to understand later when I go to the data, what does that mean? So what I'm going to do is consider an economy with a set of n industries, and each industry produces one good, denoted by yi. And economists love to talk about widgets. So yi is our usual notation for the widgets produced by industry I. And this is actually very important. Industry I is going to be subject to some distortion, which could come from markets. It could come from the fact that industries have monopoly or oligopoly power. And this means that if it costs $1 to make a widget, if it costs me $1, but I have some monopoly power, I might charge you $1.50. So that extra 50 cents is the markup. And that's like pure profit for me as an industry. And we're going to see that that profit, some of it might go back to the owners of the firms, which might be all of us, society. Some of it might get lost. It might be government waste. It might be that some foreign country owns our firms and that goes out of our GDP, but some of it stays within our GDP. And here's the key modeling component. I'm going to assume that industry I has a production technology where to make Y units of widgets, it needs to use some labor, it needs to use some intermediate inputs, and this production function is going to change depending on which inputs, which discrete subset of other industries you use to make your own goods. And most importantly, this A term is the productivity, is how many goods can I make per unit of labor and intermediate inputs. So different recipes are going to give you different productivities. The consumer side is somewhat standard. It comes mostly from Econ 101. There's going to be essentially one household. This is a very simplifying assumption, but in macro, it is often standard. Some people are relaxing these kind of assumptions. And we just assume there's one household. They consume goods from each of the N industries, because at the end of the day, these aren't just industries trading with each other in a closed system. At the end of the day, someone has to consume these goods. And we're also going to assume that the representative household provides labor to the firms, and they have no leisure. They just provide this unit of labor regardless of what the wage is. I'm going to normalize the wage to 1. Like in Econ 101, this household doesn't just maximize its utility, it faces some constraint. In particular, it spends about, that's the wrong button. It spends, the sum of prices times consumption. This is how much it spends. It earns $1, or one, I normalize the wage to 1. So it earns 1 unit of wage for the 1 unit of labor it provides. And then it gets, some fraction of the profits that the firms make. So this is how much the firms sell. This is how much the firms keep in profits. Like that's the 50 cents that I kept from that $1.50. That's how much I kept in profits. And then, if lambda I is close to 1, that means that goes all back to the households. It means that the firms are owned by the people. If it goes in taxes, the government gives those taxes back to the people in terms of services. Or it could be close to 0, which means the firms are owned by only a few people. It doesn't go back to the households at all. It could also mean that the government wastes it, or there's some friction in the system. And this is going to be very important when we talk about discontinuities. So I'm not just highlighting it for completeness. And we have some standard assumptions. These are some assumptions that are purely standard. They're as general as possible. And what they mean is that we can find this equilibrium, that like all these optimization problems going underneath, they have solutions. And I tried as much as possible. So when we say quasi-concavity, we don't need like these functions to be differentiable. They are as general as possible as long as we can find an equilibrium. And they're extremely standard in economics. And here is the main difference, like the main twist in this model, which is when you have firms, and these firms are in a competitive market, right? So for every industry, you're going to have many, many firms that are trying to find the cheapest way to produce the good for this industry. Everybody's trying to see how they can make the cheapest computer, the cheapest car, and so on, so that they can sell it to consumers and other firms for a little bit of a markup. And what they're going to do is they're going to take these intermediate inputs and labor and try to minimize the sum of labor plus how much they pay in inputs, subject to producing 1 unit of the good. And something I didn't say from my previous slide is if you double your inputs, you double your widgets. So this problem is kind of this invariant to scale. If you can make 1 unit for $1, you can make 100 units for $100. And the real twist is here, that this cost function, which I defined here in equation 3, depends on my set of suppliers. And because this cost function depends on my set of suppliers, and I can choose my set of suppliers, I got And I got another optimization problem after I minimized my cost to say, well, now I want to choose a set of suppliers that minimizes my cost function. That's a discrete combinatorial problem. And that is really the twist in this model, that we leave the land of this continuous economics to say, I can change my set of suppliers, and that is going to change the whole input-output network when you take all these decisions by the firms in aggregate. And as I said, this is going to be an equilibrium. What that means is firms minimize costs, the price are determined by the markup and the firm's decisions, and consumers maximize their welfare, and at the end, all these prices make markets clear. And this is through the magic of some fixed point theorem. And this is just saying that the market is going to find what this network is, what the consumption inputs are. The real innovation here is that there's this discrete Tarski fixed point theorem that helps this network be determined by the market, not by a central planner. There's a fixed point theorem. I'm going to skip it. One very important thing, and I'm going to illustrate this with examples, is that this talk about efficiency. So efficiency means this equilibrium that the market finds, this input-output structure for the economy. Does it maximize welfare? Does it maximize, the well-being of households and consumers? Is it the best one you could have found? Or is there room for government intervention? And what we find is that if there are no distortions, meaning if there are no markups, if there are no taxes, if there is nothing that is changing the decisions the firms would make in terms of how much inputs to buy, then this is efficient. There is no need for government intervention here. However, if there are distortions, if there's monopoly power, if there's oligopoly power, if firms are charging more than, and they're making lots of profits or charging more than it costs to make a good, then the fact that they can now choose their suppliers, those distortions, that fact that I could buy, what's something that's like very, very monopoly? Like I could buy, I can't think of a good example right now. I'm sorry? You think cell phones are monopoly? Yeah. It's a kind of an oligopoly, right? So yeah, you could say that I could buy all my employees' cell phones. Like I could do it. I could put like a cell phone in like every one of like my machines and like do something. But because of markups, I'm just not going to do it. It's too expensive. And that just takes away one of these links in this network that could have downstream effects down the way that could affect the whole economy. So the fact that now you can choose the network amplifies the distortive effects of these markups. And that's the point of this slide, that this network is really amplifying if there are distortive effects in the economy. And here's an example. Actually, I have two examples, but I'm going to just go to the one with nice pictures. Here's an example where here I've set the parameters of this economy so that all the firms are going to start with parameters so that their optimal choice is to not use any of the other firms as suppliers. So the parameters are set that way. And then there's a little bit of epsilon that if you just were able to make these firms epsilon more productive, what this example shows is imagine that I can now make firm 1 epsilon more productive if it uses all the other firms as suppliers. Firm 1 is going to say, that's great, I'm going to now use all the other firms. And firm 1's product is going to become cheaper because it just became more productive. Its product becomes cheaper. Now, because its product becomes cheaper, every other firm wants to now use firm 1 as a supplier. And now all the other firms' products become cheaper because that's essentially a propagation of that productivity from firm 1 to all the other firms. And because of the way I set the parameters of this example, what you end up is with this chain reaction where you go with a very, very small productivity shock. The firms went from not using any other firm as suppliers to a complete graph. Every firm uses every other firm as a supplier. The example I skipped shows how this effect can compound with markups to give you a very discontinuous change in GDP. So all these new sales relations, every single unit of profit that comes out of those new relations of firms selling to each other contributes something to GDP, and therefore you have a very discontinuous effect on GDP from a very continuous effect on productivity. This is when I told you I have one slide on growth. This is the slide. So this is a very important part of the paper. If you're interested, I recommend that you all go read the paper. There's a lot more in there. But essentially, all we're doing at the end of the day, I mean, there's a lot of market mechanisms and profit maximizing mechanisms. But the very, very short and simplified version is that in existing models of economic growth, there are two ways you can get this endogenous growth. You can have an incentive to add new goods, to create new goods. And what happens is you have to create new goods at an exponential rate to get exponential growth. The other kinds of models are you can increase the quality. And it has the same issue. You have to increase the quality at an exponential rate. Here, we kind of get that exponential rate for almost free. Because what's happening is that every period, we are adding one new good. We're not adding exponentially many goods. We're not making the products exponentially higher quality. And what that does is through the, show me that again.
Yeah, sorry. 5.
Oh, OK. So what that means is that every time that one new good arrives, like computers, 60, 70, 100 years ago, computers didn't exist as we know them today. Now they're everywhere. So every time that one new good arrives, it doubles the number of possible recipes I can use to make my product that everybody can use to make their products. And it has spillover effects throughout the economy. So this is why it's a completely new type of economic growth model. I'm going to completely skip this section. The only thing I'm going to say is that I'm just going to cut straight to the punchline. There is this empirical fact in input-output networks, which is true in a lot of network data, which is that in-degrees are very normally distributed and they're very small. And out-degrees follow a Pareto distribution. What does this mean in this context? It means if I'm an industry and I look at the data and I ask, to make $1 of my product, how many dollars do I pay to my average supplier to make $1 of my product? So to make $1 of iPhone, you end up paying less than 0.0003 cents to the GPS chip, for example. So an iPhone costs $700 to make, and of those $700, about $2 go to the GPS chip. So the average amount I pay to my suppliers, to each supplier, is negligible. And that's something we get in the math from this model, which is also true in the data. However, there are superstar suppliers. This means that they have very, very high out-degree. The out-degree is Pareto distributed. What this means is that for every, on average, most of the suppliers, the amount that they will get from their average customer is 0. It's very close to 0. It will go to 0 as the number of possible customers goes to infinity. But some will be superstars, which means even when the number of customers goes to infinity, they will get a very substantial amount of dollars for every dollar that their customer pays, like a substantial amount of cents. You multiply that by the fact that the economy is trillions of dollars, and that means that the superstar suppliers are actually getting a lot of money. And that is essentially this power law that we derive in our paper, straight from the fact that the model matches this data that we see about the distribution of revenues. Now, actual data, let me be somewhat quick with this regression. What we did was we went look at these input-output tables, and we asked which industries changed their sets substantially. Here we're measuring the change in set by measuring the set difference for a firm between year, let's say, 1992 and 1987. So we assign a dummy to each industry for the year 1982 if their set of suppliers changed significantly from 1987. So if it changed significantly from the previous year observation, and by significantly we mean it's above the 20th percentile of all the other industries. And if it's above the 20th percentile, we assign a dummy that, yes, this industry changed their input significantly. And then we match that to productivity data from the National Bureau of Economic Research. So they have productivity data for all the manufacturing industries. And we run this regression that says, how much did productivity change as a function of whether this firm changed their set of suppliers significantly? And we add some industry fixed effects and time fixed effects so that as not to get confused with any secular trends in productivity or any trends in productivity for that industry. And what we get is some nice significant results. And through the magic of economic modeling, we can actually plug these numbers into our model, into our simulations, and say the annual rate of growth in GDP between 1987 and 2007 was about between 1% and 2%. And while these numbers must be interpreted with caution, as in most economic papers, we do get that about 0.42% can be explained by, of that 1%, 1 to 2%, about 0.42, or I would say it's about a third, can be explained by these changes in suppliers. Last but not least, we have some very, very nice Bayesian simulation algorithms. You are encouraged to check Appendix D in the paper, which took a few months to write. But we did come up with some nice Bayesian estimation of what these edge-specific productivities are. And I think I'm going to conclude not with my conclusion slide, but just giving you an idea of how qualitatively different this kind of model is. If I plugged in a 1% shock to the electronic sector in a standard macro model, the electronic sector is just one sector out of 400. That's not going to change GDP by much. But if I plug it into these endogenous networks, because you have this network is changing and you add 288 edges to the whole network just by shocking the electronic sector, you're going to get a much more substantial change in GDP that is a reasonable number. It's still 0.72%. It's not that much. But that gives you a qualitative different implication for industrial production policies, for thinking about R&D, and so on. So thank you.
All right, well, let me abuse my position as moderator then for a second to ask, as the Tarski geek in the room, can you tell us a little bit more about the fixed point argument you use for existence?
Sure. So I can get my slide for reference because it's been like a year since I wrote that proof. But so at the end of the day, you're going to start with an arbitrary network, right? You start with an arbitrary network, and what happens is you iterate. So you say, for this network, what would prices be? And then you ask again, well, if I had these prices and I were to choose my suppliers that minimized my own costs, given that I face these prices, you say, what would that network look like? So you start with some network as 0, and you run one loop of this iteration where you say, here's what the prices would be with this network, and here's what the network would look with those prices. And you end up with a different network S1. What happens is that the prices themselves form a monotonic decreasing function. Because the firms are optimizing and they always want to choose the lowest prices, they're going to choose the network so as to minimize all the prices in the economy, all the costs. And these prices form a monotonically decreasing function. And at the end of the day, through the magic of Tarski's fixed point theorem, you're going to find a fixed point for prices. Once you find a fixed point for prices, the network doesn't change anymore. And you've converged on what the right prices are, what the right network is. And then using the quasi-concavity assumptions for production and for consumption, you're going to get unique demands and consumption bundles. Thanks for asking.
Cool, thanks. Any further questions?
Would a potential
policy so what from this be stronger antitrust enforcement? If you
mean-
break up firms, you get more products, you get more productivity?
I mean, that's always a great policy. I don't think this paper would make a difference in the in informing that. Although it makes a difference in informing the macro events, because just to bring it back to the paper, yes, a lot of the implications of the paper, especially on GDP, are about markups, right? If we don't have markups, then there's no distortions. Then there's no story about GDP increases more than it would in a normal model. So to some extent, yes, and just in a more general extent, there is definitely a large problem that has become worse over the last 20 years with monopoly and oligopoly power across the world. So even if this paper didn't exist, yes, we need more antitrust policy.
All right, maybe on that note then, we will thank the speaker again and go to the coffee break. We will see you back here at 10:50. Let's thank him again.